welcome to the special edition of the Global View. I'm Tanveer Gill with Nikunj Dalmia. And today we have a treat for our viewers all over India. Another first on ET Now mega exclusive. The world knows him as an American investor, a hedge fund manager, a philanthropist, and the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund with an asset base of $160 billion. But among all those titles, the one that warms his heart the most is that of a mentor. His motto in life right now being to share with the world the wisdom he has accumulated through his career, long-standing career, spanning over 4 decades. Yes, over 40 years.
Well, Tanveer, he is an out-of-box thinker, an original thinker, and his book Principles is one of the best-selling business books in the entire world. So with great pleasure, let me now introduce and welcome Mr. Ray Dalio on ET Now. Mr. Dalio, it is an absolute honor and a pleasure to have you on the show. Tanveer and me are very excited to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me.
Well, both Tanveer and me...
Thank you for letting me be there.
Right. Tanveer and me both have read your book, and my curiosity is that what really inspired you to write this book where you have openly shared your edge? And one would imagine that hedge fund managers, they never like to share their edge.
Well, first of all, this is mostly a book about an approach to life. And what motivated me is that I'm at a stage in my life where I'm passing things along. I think that life has 3 phases in it. In the first phase, you're dependent on others, you're learning. In the second phase, you're working, you're trying to be successful, and others are dependent on you. Then when you get to the third phase, in order to be free and joyous, others have to be successful without you. And in that transition from the second phase to the third phase, I think it's very important to pass along what one has learned. So I feel a responsibility to do that, and that's why I did the book. And it's not about hedge fund. Hedge fund is just, investing, I should say, is just one activity. This is really an approach to any sort of activity, and the reason I passed it along is that over the years I stumbled on an exercise that helped me a lot. Every time I would make a decision, I would write down the reasons I made that decision, reflecting on it. And so whatever I encountered at the time, I had criteria for dealing with. And I wrote those down. And I found that to be invaluable because it helped me. Because we encounter the same things over and over again in our lives. And when we say we're encountering another one of those and we have principles to look at to decide how to handle those, that's good. And so by writing them down over a period of time, I found that I could clarify them every time I ran into another one of those. And I found it was invaluable to be able to communicate with others, the people I worked with, so we could think, what are our principles and why and what was the rationale? So over a period of 25 years, I wrote down these essentially recipes for success, and they helped our relationships, and it helped us be more successful. So when I accumulated those and decided that this year, 2017, is the transition year from my second phase of my life to my third phase, I wanted to pass those along.
Right. Mr. Dalio, you have seen it all, and, aptly titled in your book as well, it's Life and Work, and principles that govern us in both those aspects. Now, having seen it all, when it comes to, having experienced varied market and economic cycles, having made your mistakes and made amends, when you reflect back at your life, career, how do you reflect on your beginnings when your principles on both those aspects of life were still evolving to where you are today, putting it all together for the world?
Well, one's perspective changes very much over a period of time. In my case, for the large part, I would go after my audacious goals, and I would then encounter my challenges. I think this is true for everybody. And those encounters of the problems then let me reflect on it. And by doing that over and over again, particularly by making mistakes, which I were most valuable for the learning. Painful mistakes are a fantastic way to learn if you reflect well on them. So I found that my whole perspective changed by doing this over and over again. For example, in the beginning, everything would seem big, and they would see big, painful mistakes, and they were uncomfortable for me. But over time, I began to find those mistakes almost like puzzles that would give me gems if I could solve the puzzle. And the puzzle was, what would I do differently in the future so that it wouldn't be so painful and I would make those mistakes? And the gems were principles that I could then learn to be better in the future, and I would write down those principles. So my attitude about mistake making started to change. I began to find them as curiosities and then solve puzzles and build those principles. This had a big effect. My whole attitude, my whole way of seeing things changed. You know, I evolved from not having anything and not being successful in any regard to having, quite a bit and being quite successful. And I saw how it was very different than I imagined it would be. Because, you think that the smartest people are, they're terrific and they're smart and they're successful. And then you imagine what it's like to be on the top and so on. And it's quite different than you imagine. For example, it's very interesting to me to see that the key to my success has been really also in knowing what I don't know, how to deal with that. In other words, there's a humility that I learned from mistakes that changed my whole attitude about thinking, that made me more successful. And I found that as I got to know the most successful people in the world, that they also had that. If you're interested, I'll tell you the story of how that happened. And, and it changed my attitude about decision making, which then, made all the difference in the world.
We would love to hear that. I mean, what was that one experience that changed it for you?
Well, I started my business in 1975, and so 7 years after I started my business, I was in a position where I had calculated that foreign countries could not pay back American banks. And it was a very controversial point of view because I said we were going to go through a major debt crisis, and that would have a big effect on the economic crisis. And I calculated that, very controversial, and it turned out to be right in one respect, in that in August 1982, Mexico defaulted on its debts, and we then had a debt crisis. And that brought me into a position where I was asked to, given a lot of public attention. I was asked to testify to Congress to explain this. I was asked to be on Wall Street Week, which was a television show at the time. And I thought we were going to have an economic collapse. I could not have been more wrong, okay? While we had these debt crises, and we had the debt crisis of the 80s, the August 1982 was the exact bottom in the stock market. Federal Reserve issued printed money, and interest rates came down, and it was the opposite. So I was painfully wrong. And at that time, it was so bad that I had to let people in my company go. I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to help pay for my family's bills. This was so painful, but it turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life, because it gave me the humility and the fear of being wrong, that gave me an open-mindedness, that shifted my perspective from thinking I'm right to asking myself, how do I know I'm right? And with that, it made me do things differently. It made me want to find the smartest people who I could find who would disagree with me and worry about being wrong. And it opened my mind. It gave me that perspective to take in those things, to deal with the risks of being wrong, as well as the opinions to be able to make bets. And in doing that, in learning the art of thoughtful disagreement and the ability to take in and also to manage risks in a different way, it significantly raised my probabilities of being right. So that experience was a very invaluable, painful experience, but it was one of the most valuable ones. And as a result, I built a company that is an idea meritocracy. In other words, with independent thinkers who are the smartest people I could find, who think differently, and can work themselves through their disagreements to raise their probabilities of being right, because high-quality collective decision-making in an idea meritocracy so improves one's chances of being right. So that I give you as an example of the evolution. There's been evolution in many ways, but that's one of the most important experiences for me.
So, Mr. Dalio, what really fascinated me and Tanveer when we read your book was that you are emphasizing on the power of thoughtful disagreement. Now, Mr. Dalio, ideas are like your children. You always think yours are to be the best. How does a group of intelligent people who are individual thinkers who have disagreement then finally conclude something which is common?
I think the best ideas winning out is the most important thing, and learning is the most important thing. And so to have an idea meritocracy, or I would say to have any successful relationship, to have the most successful relationships, whether it's a marriage or an organization and so on, you have to have an idea meritocracy. That's best. And you have to have rules of the game that are fair, that the parties believe are fair. And so there's 3 steps. First, to put your honest thoughts on the table for everybody to see, and everybody sees what they're honestly thinking. Second, to understand the art of thoughtful disagreement. In other words, to have it prompt curiosity and to listen, to take in, as well as to put out, in order to try to learn and get yourselves together into a better place than anyone would be individually. So first, put your thoughts on the table. Second, the art of thoughtful disagreement. And then third, everybody has to have protocols for getting past disagreements if the disagreements remain, whether that's in a personal relationship or whether it's a country or whatever, a company. You have to have those protocols. And if you have those 3, then it's a very powerful way to have an idea meritocracy. I've also found that the idea meritocracy and being fair with each other allows one to have more meaningful work, more successful work, and more successful relationships, because that radical truthfulness and that radical transparency builds confidence and builds trust and builds deeper relationships, even as it also improves the decision making. So that's been invaluable. I think anybody, whether it's a group of people in a family or whether it's a country, needs to have those kinds of things in order to make the best decisions possible.
How does one break through the typical mindset of pain plus reflection is equal to fear or caution? Because, when those 2 elements come together, those 2 feelings come together, then one often goes on the back foot.
Yes, I think it's a function of how the brain works. I've asked neuroscientists about this, psychologists. We have different parts of our brain. The thoughtful part of our brain, prefrontal cortex, that which is thoughtful, is one part. Then we have the amygdala, which is this emotional fight or flight part. When we have pain, we're in a situation where we tend to react emotionally. If one calms oneself down and then reflects on the pain, because the pain should be a cue. that something is wrong, that maybe you could do something differently, or how do you approach that situation? That pain, after it passes, if it prompts reflection, it allows, those reflections allow you to learn lessons that create improvements. But the emotional part has to be dealt with the intellectual part. When they're together, when they're harmonized, one is able to make a better decision. I know then that I think that's the biggest challenge of mankind. Well, one of the biggest challenges of mankind is certainly the individual being attached to opinions that can be wrong, or being attached to the ego of needing to be right. If one could give those things up and open oneself up to the possibility of being wrong and taking in, one can learn and one could make better decisions. So one has to start, I think, with realizing that and then saying, how do you get there? I know for me, for example, meditation has been an important way for me to connect my subconscious with my consciousness in terms of giving me a certain equanimity that helps. But in any case, this is a discipline that I've found that people intellectually want once they understand it, and then it's a practice. The practice of being able to realize that there's an emotional attachment to one's opinions and that it's better to give them up is intellectual, and then with practice, usually it takes about 18 months, one's attitude and one's effectiveness changes. I've found that works very well in our company.
Mr. Dalio, whereas in India we are not new to yoga and meditation, I understand that, like you said, your day also involves meditation. So could you walk us through that process? From how many years you've been meditating, how many times in a day do you meditate, how long do you meditate?
I started in 1969, so I guess, well, that's, what is that, 48 years ago? Something? I don't know. Anyway, a long time ago. I typically meditate for about 20 minutes before breakfast and 20 minutes before dinner.
What has that done for your, for your intuition, for your gut instinct? Because a lot of connecting the conscious part of your brain with the subconscious is really about stimulating how you intuitively think about things, intuitively think about decisions, and how you approach them. Problem solving, essentially.
Yeah. A lot of wonderful and also terrible things come from the subconscious part of the brain. In other words, intuition, imagination, creativity. These are not things that one consciously muscles through. They come from the subconscious part of the brain, and they're wonderful things. But also a lot of subliminal things can be harmful. The emotions that you regret, and you do those things. And so as they come up, the ability to have them come up and then reconcile those with the intellectual so that you have triangulation of both is, I found, to be invaluable. It's, like one looking at oneself and reconciling those two brains. I call it the two yous. In everyone, there's two yous. There's the upper level you, that's the reflective you that can look at the world reflectively, calmly, with objectivity. And then there's the lower level you, which is the subliminal you that has wonderful and terrible things that sort of come up. And when you reconcile those, then you're probably going to be able to make the best decisions, and you're going to learn about yourself. You'll be more together, as they say. So that's what the experience is like for me, and then in our company, it's been very powerful in being able to have that idea of meritocracy.
Mr. Dalio, unlike a lot of individuals who like to own up to their triumphs and they hide their mistake, you're very open about admitting your mistakes. So despite your principles, what would you say has been your recent big mistake, and what have you learned from it?
Oh, gee, I make different. One of the great things about being in the investment business or being even an entrepreneur and so on. The advantage of making a lot of mistakes is you learn how to be a professional mistake maker and convert them into benefits anyway. So I have so many. But I would say my biggest mistake probably was in not knowing how to transition the leadership of my company very well, not having governance. I needed to learn about governance better because I formed my company 43 years ago, and I then at a stage as I was describing earlier, that the most important thing is for me to have other people be successful. And I didn't create a governance system because I just ran the business and I passed it to others to run the business. And I learned about at that what the checks and balance should be, how to create a governance system. That was important. I learned how, and I'm still learning, how to make other people successful without me. And I've made some painful mistakes along that lines, but it's helped my learning a lot. But anyway, that comes to mind as probably my biggest, most painful mistake of the last few years.
Right. Mr. Dalio, thanks very much for sharing that. I also wanted to ask you, given the fact that Bridgewater Associates has been credited by calling the 2008 crisis right, how do you reflect back at that decision? What drove you to have that sense that things are going down and going down pretty quickly? And, again, how does that really tie in with your overall view on how decision making should happen, whether it's in your company or in general?
It's such a good example. In order to be successful in the markets or be successful as an entrepreneur, one has to be an independent thinker that bets against the consensus and is right, because the consensus is built into the price. So you can't be successful in the markets if you're betting with the consensus. You have to find out when the consensus is wrong. And when you're doing that, there's a high probability that you also could be wrong. How do you know that you're right when everybody else is wrong? So one needs to be comfortable doing that, first of all. And one needs to have this independent thinkers who will then debate each other in order to raise the probabilities of being right. And then one still needs to manage the risks of that bet of being right. So that was a very big thing. We ran our calculations, and we don't care what the rest of the world thinks. One of the big problems of the world in investing is that there's such a consensus that everybody believes something to be true. When everybody believes something to be true in the markets, it's priced into the markets, and so you have to think independently to be effective. So it was that approach of having an independent point of view and also having this thoughtful disagreement that we could get to, which was so invaluable. Because then we calculated. We could see that the future would be different than the past. For example, on the debt problems. We ran through the calculations of what the debt service would be, and we could see, just logically, that there was going to be a payments problem, particularly houses and so on. People who looked at the past believed the opposite, because there was no mortgage problem of that magnitude that it existed, and houses always went up and so on. So they extrapolated the past. What I've learned in my life is that all the surprises that I've had that have been costly mistakes or surprises have happened because of things that happened before, but never in my lifetime. So I knew that I had to go beyond my lifetime and study history and understand the mechanics of it. So that's what we did. We did the calculations in 2007, and we could see that we were in a bubble, and we could do the calculations to see the debt crisis, and then we, then managed that in a cautious way, and we did, as you say, very well. I think we made 14% when the market as a whole, assets as a whole, went down. So anyway, that's how we did it.
Mr. Dalio,
that's how our philosophy or our operation of thoughtful disagreement helped.
on various public forums, you've said that markets, they always follow a cycle. Sometimes it's a boom, sometimes it's a bust. And the year 2017 will be a year of transition. So give us your understanding of the financial market history. What is coming next now that transition is on?
Okay, I think it's important. Let me define the transition. From 2008 until 2017, central banks pushed interest rates down to zero. Most central banks, reserve currency central banks, pushed interest rates down to zero or below zero, and pushed out in total $15 trillion worth of buying of financial assets, mostly bonds. And those got carried through the system to push financial assets up. In other words, when they bought a bond, then the seller of that bond got cash, and they bought other financial assets. And as a result, all financial assets and liquidity in the economy improved, and we had the move from 2008 until the move to 2017. We are now at a transition point in which we're moving from that environment, that's characterized that environment, to an environment in which that is reversing gradually. In other words, there's a tightening of monetary policy as we're moving into the next phase. And this is very cyclical. When economies reach certain levels of operating rates, unemployment rates, and so on, this process of shifting from an easing to a tightening begins. And that has an implication for everything. Has an implication for asset prices, has an implication for the global economy, and so on. Unlike in 2007, when we calculated that we would have a financial problem because there was a debt problem, we don't have that same sort of circumstance. But we are entering now this new phase of the cycle in which over a period of time, over the next year, 2, 3, it is going to be progressively more risky because as asset prices rise, as interest rates rise, and you are in that cycle, no central bank gets it perfectly. That's why we have recessions. And so as there is this movement of toward a greater tightening gradually, that balancing act is going to become more difficult. And asset prices are all priced off of interest rates. In other words, there's a term structure of interest rates that you could see. There's a cash rate, there's a bond rate, and so on. And that's also reflected in equity prices because all assets compete. Expected returns of assets are going to be very, very low in the future. We know that. We can see that in the term structure. So if interest rates rise at a rate which is faster than is discounted in that curve, then asset prices will start to fall and have an effect. So while we don't have an economic debt problem of the sort that we're having in 2008, we are approaching that part of the cycle. In addition, we have other important problems in the economy, in particularly the developed world's economy. The U.S. economy, the European economy, Japanese economy, even the Chinese economy, in that a lot of debt and other obligations, pension obligations, healthcare obligations have built up. And we've also encountered a difference, an important difference in wealth, a wealth disparity, and with that an opportunity disparity that's causing a tension between, let's say, the haves and the have-nots. That tension is manifest in politics, manifest in our situation. There are two economies, basically. There's an economy of, let's say, the top 20%, and you look at the economy of the bottom 80%, two different economies. I actually divided the economy in the United States, and we did in other countries, into the top 40% and the bottom 60% so we could see what the majority of people at the bottom were. And the wealth gap is an enormous consideration. In the United States, the top 1/10 of 1% of the population's wealth is greater or is equal to the bottom 90% combined. So there's a wealth gap, and there's also a values gap. We're losing the sense of common principles and common values. So there's a tension that lies beneath this. So as we progress over this next 1, 2, and 3 year period, there is going to be a greater squeeze, financial squeeze, due to the fact that we have these obligations that are going to increasingly squeeze us, pension obligations, debt, and healthcare obligations. That means that they can't fully be met. And we have a vulnerability that if we have a downturn, an economic downturn, I think that that's going to cause more tension, more conflict between these populations. So I don't see a financial crisis of the sort that's anything of the sort like the 2008 financial crisis. But I do think that we're going to have a different kind of set of difficulties if we take over, let's say the next 3 years. I don't see a particular problem imminently, but 3 years or 4 years, 2 years is not that far away.
It isn't. And given the debt levels across the world, Mr. Dalio, I have to ask you, how do you view the Fed's policy stance into 2018 under the new chairman, Jerome Powell? He has stated that he doesn't see risks so heightened to derail the system, doesn't foresee a too big to fail sort of scenario. Your thoughts?
I think that there's an awareness and a caution of the sorts of things that I'm talking about. I have conversations with Fed and other central bankers, and I think that there's a caution and then a realization. So at the same time, I think that there is this tension, this difficulty, as inflation pressures and operating rates rise, a sense of running into that part of the cycle that'll be difficult. So, it will be an increasingly delicate balance, and I think that by and large, there's a realization of that. That produces a certain amount of caution, but it doesn't change the fact that that balance will become increasingly difficult.
Mr. Dalio, so if interest rate will act like gravity for stock markets, do you think the bloated P multiple which equities are enjoying because of artificially low interest rates, they could also see a timely correction?
Well, yes, because all assets compete with each other. So when you, like you refer to, when you lower that interest rate, then you lower the future expected return of all assets, like bonds. Bonds go up in price, so they have essentially a higher, a higher price to earnings multiple for a bond when the interest rate goes down. You lower the interest rate, it goes up. And that's true of all assets. It's true of private equity. It's true of all equity. So it is that anchor, as you describe it. And so as we're moving into that part of the cycle, it affects all assets, and that's why I'm referring to the fact that as we move in there, yes, it's a factor. But it's not overvalued in that all of these assets today are not expensive in relation to each other or in relationship to cash. So equities are not expensive in relationship to cash rates or bond interest rates. So and there's lots of liquidity. In other words, they put out a lot of money, this $15 trillion worth of purchases, and the world has quite a lot of liquidity, and it all has to compete to go into something. And so equities are not expensive, even though their multiples are high, any more than the multiples of bonds or the low cash interest rates, which they compete with. In relationship, they're not high. So that's where we are. The key when we go forward is what happens to liquidity through central bank policy, because if they pull it back for one, they'll pull it back for them all, and then those expected returns start to change. You have to understand that when asset prices go up, a lot of that price rise is having a present value effect. In other words, it's the equivalent of pulling future returns to the present. Because as interest rates go down and those present values go up, it means that the future returns are going to be lower. And that'll have a big effect on producing this squeeze that I'm talking about. So yeah, the multiples are high, but it doesn't mean that it's risky if the interest rates don't rise faster than discounted, and that if liquidity is there, because the liquidity's got to go into investments.
Mr. Dalio, we have about 15 minutes to go, so I have a couple more questions for you. First, of course, on the state of the U.S. economy. If we are seeing rates go up in the U.S., on the other hand, you also have one more aspect that's cushioning the markets, which is the potential of the U.S. tax reform coming through, and growth also picking up to 3.3%. How do you tie in the outlook for the U.S. economy? Is the growth real, inclusive, and sustainable? And can the reform bill fuel markets even further amidst a rate tightening cycle?
I'll comment on the U.S. economy, but I think it's important to realize now that the U.S. economy, while very important economy, that the Indian economy, that the Chinese economy, that the Asian economy, that the world economy is also very important to the world economy. So we shouldn't just be looking at the U.S. economy and over squinting at the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is going to benefit from stimulation by a combination of reduced regulations. If you reduce regulations, it's stimulative to the economy. There may be other costs to reduce regulations, but they're stimulating the economy. So that will produce a bit of a pickup in the economy. Not very much, not noticeable, I don't believe. And of course, don't confuse how asset prices are changing, like stock prices are changing, with the wealth of the economy as a whole. What I mean by that, excuse me, is that if you lower tax rates, corporate tax rates, then by necessity, that their stocks are worth more. You're going to take in more return. So that shift in tax rates means that you have a benefit to the stock market, or you have a benefit to asset prices that is not necessarily commensurate with the benefit of the overall economy. Another characteristic of this economy is that to the technology that is improving profitability by a lot is also having the effect of displacing workers or changing the employment situation, which also widens the wealth gap and is causing the tensions that, like we say, with a two-part economy. Very good for profits and very good for productivity in general. But it is also something that one has to keep in mind in terms of thinking about that economy. When I net all of those things out, I think that we're probably in a vicinity that will still have between 2.5% and 3% growth rate in terms of that as basically a trend line growth rate. But we are coming into the later part of the cycle. So if I was to take what's the next 5 years growth rate over that, probably is going to be less than that because of where we are in the cycle. So that's how the U.S. looks at it. I must say that I'm very impressed and very optimistic about India. And the reason I say this, we have created 10-year growth estimates and formulas for estimating what 10-year growth numbers are around the world. And we do that by looking at a number of indicators. Some of the most important indicators are what is the cost per hour of an educated person, and how does that compare with that which exists in the world? The countries that have the most educated people per hour tend to grow faster than those that have costly educated workers. The second factor, big factor, is the level of indebtedness. And when countries have high levels of indebtedness, they grow at slower rates in the future because they have those burdens. The third factor is culture, and in particular, the cultural influences on efficiency. Do you have a bureaucracy? Do you have a culture in which there's work hard, do all of that? Very interesting that India, we've done these numbers and we've done these projections, has relatively low debt rates and relatively attractive, intelligent population of intelligent people at economically at lower costs, very cost effective. And one of the biggest challenges of India, though it still has a great amount of potential, has been the bureaucracy, the absence of openness to foreign investment, that lack of flexibility, how long it takes to set up a business, what the efficiency is, the openness of the capital markets, corruption index has been something. So we have indices, we have numbers that reflect all of these things. And it's been, so the barrier in India's case were more that third category of those inefficiencies and those cultural impediments. And we've seen a lot of that changing, including, as I say, the openness to foreign investment, the corruption index is down, the bureaucracy is being reduced. And so as a result, we're projecting India to have the highest economic growth rate in the world, which would be in the vicinity of 6.5% or maybe slightly higher over the next 10 years. And if I look at that and I look at the region and so on, that is increasingly going to be an epicenter of growth. So I think when looking at the world economy, we need to put these various economies in perspective. And you asked me about the U.S. economy, but I think we'll be less U.S. economy centric in the years ahead.
Insight, Mr. Dalio. But I just wanted to touch upon, because you highlighted the wealth conflict that's troubling you in the U.S. and that keeps you thinking a lot about the state of the economy there. Does that pose a risk to the U.S.'s dominance in the world, and could it fuel a significant power shift from developed markets to emerging markets? So you've already highlighted that India would see perhaps the fastest growth over the course of the next 10 years. Would that mean that the influence of emerging markets like India over the course of the next decade would only increase?
I think every country has the things that make it efficient, and government and how the people work together to achieve a national objective and work harmoniously together is an important influence. And in the United States right now, because there is this conflict, it's not just a wealth conflict, but it's conflict of values. It's a conflict of not necessarily having common, clearly stated principles. I think that that's a risk. It depends how it's managed. I think it's an issue because it depends how efficient we are. Can we come together and clearly state our principles and be behind it? Let me put it in perspective. I think that in over the last many decades, principles, what principles do you have? What principles do you operate? And do you have common principles? Were very, very important issue. And those principles and that clarity has been lost or diminished as they used to be much more influenced by religion. In other words, religion would teach people certain types of principles. And then as there was a decline in principles, there was not an examination of what do you as an individual have as your principles. I think we're now in a new era. And that new era is individuals have got to decide for themselves what their principles are. And then when they make those decisions, then we come together and decide, do we have common principles and that are going to bind us together? Right now, I think that there's a challenge in terms of understanding, do we in the United States have common principles that are binding us together so that we can move forward? The divisions are very, very important. So I think as we go forward, that question of conflict and the efficiency of government in dealing with that. Do we have a government in which the various factions are fighting to defeat each other and are so caught up in the fight that you essentially have dysfunction? Or do you have the coming together of principles and the moving together to make the country run efficiently? I do believe will be an important question in the years to come. I don't know how that'll be dealt with. Right now, I think it's a challenge to the effectiveness of government, and I think the effectiveness of the country. At the same time, of course, there are great pockets of inventiveness. You know, Silicon Valley ideas and so on is coming out. But those things are spreading very quickly around the world. So you could see in India and other places around the world that same type of Silicon Valley type of culture expressing. And so I think the world as a whole is going to benefit from that. And I think on the margin, other emerging countries where there are cultures of that kind of innovation, creativity and so on, I think that they'll benefit more. I think one aspect of all of this is also what is a reserve currency? What is money? What is a storehold of wealth? So we were, since 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement, we formed a system in which the dollar was the center of the world's reserve currency. It was the world's reserve currency. It was tied to gold originally, and then other currencies were tied into it. And the dollar plays an important role throughout the world, dollar interest rates, dollar currency value, and so on. That role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency is also, to some extent, an artifact of what happened. So as we come into a newer period of time over the next, years, decades, we have to ask ourselves, essentially, what is the world's reserve currency, or what is a storehold of wealth? And I think that that'll be an important issue, because when you're owning a bond or you're owning debt, what you're owning is a promise to deliver a certain currency. And so over a period of time, that changes. As the economies shift, I think that will be an important issue for the future.
Mr. Dalio, you're sounding quite optimistic about India, and your economic outlook towards India is quite positive. So can I safely assume that Bridgewater would be coming to India soon?
Oh, well, the financial markets, of opening the financial markets, a lot of progress has been made. And so the opening will certainly mean that we'll be investing to the extent that there's opening. And besides, for me, I've been to India twice before, and I find it a thrilling, stimulating place to be. So I'll be there one way or another.
Right.
Okay. Mr. Dalio, a lot of my colleagues, they say, look, we've tried hard, but it is impossible to get a job in Bridgewater. Why is that?
Well, it's a competitive, it's a competitive place. Supply and demand, and it's a competitive place.
Yeah, no, we completely understand that. Maybe if you open an India office sometime, they can try their luck with the Indian arb. But Mr. Dalio, we would love to host you in India. Anytime you're making a plan to come down here, Mr. Harvard Marx has been here, Mr. Warren Buffett has been here. It'd be great to have you in Mumbai and in India soon enough.
I will be there, and I will make sure that we have contact, and hopefully I'll see you there.
Yes.
I would appreciate your kindness of your hospitality.
Well, we would love to host you here and look forward to having you in our homeland soon enough. But thanks very much. You shared some great insights about your book, Principles, Life and Work, and of course about the market conditions currently. We really appreciate your time for this extensive and fairly in-depth conversation.
It's been an honor to have you on the show, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.